let's get right into it. Newspapers, largely white male architecture critics, are a reflection of the structural inequalities of the built environment and are not equipped to deal with our current time of crisis, says Mimi Zeiger. A great prompt, and a prompt I would agree with. In a lot of ways, that's accurate, right? And she goes in. She starts by naming off some of these. Yeah, right. I mean, it's in Dezeen, right? We're not quite there yet, but like we have to think about not just author, but the article itself and media, and kind of try to push that all together and figure out just what is going on. But let's first like get into the article and figure out what it's saying. So, the most recently, yes, Blair came in, announced on Twitter that there's an opening essentially as a architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune. Okay, so names were floated. Mimi did not get it, but was excited about the LA Times architecture critic spot. There have been discussions about the LA Times. Yes, LA Times. I remember that was a big deal. I was in LA when the LA Times architecture critic spot opened up. And yes, I'll tell you, there was a lot of kerfuffle. Okay. So, and yeah, I mean, I tend to, I agree with Mimi on this point. Like, these positions are few and far between, and they are, maybe the architecture critic position at a large newspaper like that is a little bit like a fellowship right now. like everybody wants one. We all talk bad about them, but we'd all take one and go, you know. Or, but we know that it's like not really doing much for the discipline, and it's pretty ridiculously like impossible to predict, or and whatnot. But we'd all like to take one. I don't know, maybe not. But this new full-time newspaper gig with health benefits is really important, right? And Mimi makes the point that these few individuals, white and often male, hold architecture critic positions, and their entrenchment for a decade or three at the top of the food chain systemically restricts a plurality of voices from reaching the widest of audiences, from benefiting from networks of power, and from economic solidity. Of course, right? A material analysis of any sort of position of power, it's exactly like, how institutions might have something like tenure, right? This economic and or solidity, as it's mentioned in the text, is the kind of backing that it takes to give you to essentially. Let me put it this way: the architecture critic, or the critic in general, should be disinterested. Okay, disinterested. What we mean by disinterested, or what I mean by disinterested, it kind of comes. It's a kind of academic word for the process by which you can evaluate something where the result of that thing won't harm you. In other words, you can critique something that you are disinterested in because the result, if it's good or bad, doesn't affect you, right? You might be rooting for it. You might have something to lose, right? But you're not, for example, if you're an architecture critic, you need to be able to critique a building without fear of losing your job or losing your health benefits, right? And so that disinterestedness is as a whole, or on the whole of it, that disinterestedness is one of the most important qualities a critic can have when it comes to any sort of position in any field, not just architecture. But the ability to create a disinterested group of thinkers to be critics of the world was the role of institutions of higher learning, and almost its most important role, next to education itself. And okay, so Zach Mortis, hi Zach, argued that the urgencies of our political moment demand that critics address how racial inequity is forged by the built environment, calling out this arena as the highest calling of architectural criticism. But does that go far enough? I think that's pretty legit. I want to agree with Zach. I mean, I know there's an identity issue behind what Mimi is saying, and I understand how that seeps, how important that is to this conversation, right? But this is hard to disagree with from Zach, and so I'm not so sure that setting it up as it's either architecture critics are too white or male, or architecture critics should be talking about racial inequity in the built environment. I think we could do both things. Right. Architecture continues to operate as a form of colonization and globalization. Absolutely. And if you don't believe me, go watch the video about Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro's. Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, a large New York firm, designing a indigenous art museum in Australia, right? What is that if not a continuing of the project of colonialism? Under, with the veil, with architecture as a kind of apology veil, right? Or architecture as the kind of confusing language of some kind of synergistic attempts to create links with these cultures. It's definitely something that we need to be vocal critics about, right? If we only address a critic subject without looking at the author, we risk producing criticism that trades in tokenism and extraction. Moreover, such an approach aligns Black, Indigenous, and people of color with loss and crisis rather than expressing individual narratives, stories that express a fuller range of human experience, including creativity and pleasure, pain and hope. And yes, I would. I understand the point Mimi is making here is that architecture critics shouldn't always be using Black and brown narratives to bemoan the same types of negative stories. That there are good stories about BIPOC in the society that we could use, that we could be uplifting rather than just saying how bad it is. And yes, we can also do all of these things. I don't think these things are necessarily inseparable from one another. And then it's time to abolish the architecture critic. Okay. Perhaps, of course, any good critic or writer will express this. And this is obviously, of course, for Mimi, a kind of provocation. She's certainly not right. I write this rhetorically. I mean, so let's not I'm not coming out and saying Mimi wants to abolish the critic. It's a thought. It's a thought. The idea is to abolish. As I read on this article, is to abolish the historic material conditions of the architecture critic as such, and to move that, to unseat that, to call to unseat that power is akin to an abolition standpoint, where it says, let's dismantle those systems of power and just see what comes of it. Because all we know is that those systems of power maybe have not given us a reason, or don't give us a good reason to keep them around, right? And so the article goes on, and let's just kind of finish up the article before giving takes. she links the kind of racial analysis and race struggles with abolishing prisons, and to say that this is a minor, says this is a minor, trifling, not really comparing, but I persist because I want to envision what architecture criticism might look like without a heavy capstone of the critic, when we don't feel the pressure of scarcity but revel in the richness of many voices, many perspectives. She goes on to list the lack of Black, Indigenous, people of color writers in architecture. There's a couple, but what platforms do they have? It can be exhausting and demoralizing. $1 a word. I'm I'm right there with that one. Not everyone, especially historically marginalized groups, can afford to make criticism a hobby or side gig. Ding, ding, ding. That's an important point. That's a really important point, and one that I feel on a daily basis. That I've been given a lot of leeway, or been able to make a lot of changes in my life that allow me the space to talk about these things, that make space for the ability to bring this type of content to you guys, to my Instagram page for the past 4 years, right? This is space I've been privileged enough to be able to be given, or space that I've been able to make, and I recognize that, and that's a very important point. And part of that effort, part of what I've done in my practice to recognize that fact, is to be, if you look back, is to be extremely sensitive to marginalized voices with my own content, in that, not sensitive like don't offend, but to be a good listener through the meme sphere, right? And to find the positions that are marginalized and to amplify those positions, and to take those positions up, and to say, and to call out my colleagues and myself and others for not dismantling or not recognizing their own material conditions around which surround their work, right? Those are all really important, which is why I don't know that, the architecture critic as such is necessarily abolishable, because I don't know that the architecture critic as such, as Mimi is describing it, exists anymore, and is really making that much of a change to the material environment. It kind of feels like an echo chamber, and that it's already, the architecture critic, as Mimi's describing it, has already been culturally abolished in ways that make me feel like the architecture critic has not culturally abolished, as it not canceled or culturally abolished, but that the power of a singular writer in a large local newspaper has been crippled. But I believe that the architecture critic is extremely important today. Yeah, made irrelevant. Yes, exactly. Thank you. But I believe that a reworked idea of what the architecture critic is super important today. And the idea of who the architecture critic is, or how they operate, has shifted, which is, quite literally why I'm doing what I'm doing, and how I've considered what I've been doing. Right? The meme page, the streamer, the YouTuber. These are ways of dismantling existing systems, and sort of building up our own communities around what voices we want to amplify, and how to support those voices, and choose who we as architects want to represent us, and uh, and be a medium, or be a medium that talks between architecture and the public, right? And I think that I think we have that opportunity. I have that opportunity. I'm trying to create that opportunity. I'm trying to bring in, everyone to the table, also with my own critical practice. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities there for other voices. So yeah, interesting article. Um, I think that with a little bit of additional kind of new media nuance, that Mimi's point can be transformed and go just a little bit further. That's my take, at least. So I'd love to um, talk more about it. I think it's a really important article, and yeah, I'm not going to go into the comment section, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that Mimi's point goes far enough. I think we need to. I think we really have the opportunity to create better architecture criticism, and that architecture criticism certainly needs to change, and certainly needs to do what Zach calls for, um, address how racial inequality is forged in the built environment, and it needs to uh, have a better ability to talk to the public, and to one really good way to do that is to entertain, and criticism using memes or entertainment or media to create a Trojan horse effect of deeper, more important issues. That's where I'm at. So yes, I think the architecture critic has never needed a revival or a change like it does today. What I love about this meme, Arc Humor shouts, they're typically meme of the week is go Arc Humor. I like this account. It's very lighthearted. Always typically nice, great jokes, just simple, funny stuff, quirky stuff. Doesn't try too hard to uh, uh, really enact any sort of super critical positions, but at times they will throw in a little bit of sass. But I love that Arc Humor. This is a great example for me of architecture criticism happening in a meme sphere that's starting to repackage what the architecture critic is, and how they relate to people, and how they work. This Arc Humor page is typically making, like I said, lighthearted, funny jokes, and yet there is a position that they are coming down on strong, and saying companies competing for unpaid labor and meme accounts. All right, meme accounts being the antagonists, the defenders of the people, of the labor, of the workers, of the let's say of architecture, right? And its ideals in a lot of ways. And these companies that are competing for unpaid labor aren't so obvious in our day-to-day life, but they are, media companies that run competitions that rely on these great images made by students to power online communities that then just don't really pay students for any of the airtime they give them. Maybe they pay a winner, but otherwise they just exist in that space. Or actual architecture firms that bring in often privileged students who are able to not be paid for a summer, and that's how they kind of reinforce a particular narrative about who the architect is, unpaid internships are absolutely gatekeeping, ways of gatekeeping the profession, or the clout, um, clout culture exploitation of ways of preventing people of not rich people to become like to then, not getting that internship means you don't have it on your little resume when you apply for this and that. I mean it's a cycling, right? I'm lucky enough to where I was able to take a very, very low paid summer internship at an all-star A-list architecture firm, and it's certainly done some things for me. But I have to recognize that I was able to do that, right? I was able to do that, and I'm very lucky that I was able to do that. And you'd have to be pretty blind not to see it, I think. So, good meme, and this is a great example of how the architecture critic needs to think a little differently about how they can present arguments, infiltrate public consciousness, and reframe uh, important issues that are going on in the architecture world to be better critics, right? To think about inequity. This is a absolutely a political movement demand that critics address. It's addressing how racial inequity is forged by the built environment, right? The highest calling of architecture criticism, right here, happening, and it's really important to recognize. And I think it's a good example that I know Mimi. Sorry to not to take it back to that, but um, maybe we need to have more conversations about this. And I think institutions in architecture need to really get behind. So we'll see if they do. I'm not so sure. I think it's important now at this moment in time that a lot of the architecture critics become extra institutional, like ArchHumor, like outside of institutions, maybe.